Welcome to the 27, presented by The Critic. We are the world's first and only student-teacher podcast on the MCU, where today I become the student, as our guest teaches me all about Charles Francis Xavier's not-so-merry band of mutants, as the one and only Mr. Schwab joins the podcast to talk all things X-Men. How are you, Mr. Schwab?
Thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be here.
It is good to have you. You're like, I feel like from talking with you on the side and then talking with Mr. Morsan that like you were one of those teachers that we needed to get on, that you have a wealth of knowledge on these things.
The right time. Everything's about timing. And the X-Men is actually when I'm supposed to make my introduction to this conversation.
Yes.
Because of the 27, I know of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all of the films, but I was an X-Men fan first.
Yes.
So even though I love the 27 and I love every Avenger movie and every single series and every version of Hawkeye that we get, hit by a truck or otherwise, I thought that the X-Men was a time where I would love to really just share all of my passion.
I was going to say, and that was like when I came to you to book you, that was what you wanted to talk about.
X-Men, absolutely.
Well, then let's just start. Let's get background information on you to start with. You can tell our listeners all about you. And where does it start with you with Marvel Comics, anything like that?
Marriage. I was a DC person until marriage, and then I was brought into the Marvel world with the X-Men in 1999, right before the movie came out. Right. So I had to do it. I'm actually a bit of a staunch chronologist. I have to see it all from the very beginning. So before the movie came out, I had to go back to 1963 and look at the original comics and really read through what the characters were originally designed to be. Yeah. And then to kind of then see the film version and decide what did they pull from this. And there are, of course, characters in the film version that were not even in the original. Wolverine didn't come till the 70s. Okay. So I didn't learn about all the characters right away, but in the past now, I guess, 20 years, 25 years, I've tried to consume as much of the universe as I can. Became very passionate about it because it's, I think, one of the most perfect series. It's I think stronger as a book than all the Avengers ones. Okay. So I can defend it that way and say as a book, I just think the X-Men have always been very strong in their storytelling roots. And
we even talked about like before, maybe not in the comics, but before popular-wise, before the Avengers, there was the X-Men.
That's
like
right.
Everyone knew, like our age, would know the X-Men growing up. They had the
Absolutely.
cartoon. They were much more known than the Avengers.
And the thing about the X-Men also is that there's something about, as a kid, reading about these characters that were born with special gifts.
Yes.
The other Avengers mostly had to be exposed to something, or their superpowers are derived from something other than birth. Yeah. And so to be genetically linked to something, I was very drawn to that aspect of it in the 90s when the cartoon show was on. But at that point, as a reader, I was still in the DC universe. Yeah. I really didn't get into the X-Men until a little bit later in my life. But I remember when watching the cartoon thinking, I like the idea of being born with a superpower, and at some point it's going to activate. That was very exciting from a childhood perspective, and I still kind of have that magic in me as an adult too, where it's like at any moment a mutant ability could sprout.
Kind of navigating through the world.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're just listening right now, you need to go and check out the Classic YouTube channel because you brought a wealth of amazing things with you today.
So this is from X-Men Apocalypse. Yeah. This was won at an auction after that film came out. Not that I recommend that film, but I like seeing screen-used things because that's the closest we can get to a comic book fully realized. Yeah. And I like the design of a lot of what they're able to realize in the film franchise, which is, the closest we're going to get to something from an art perspective than created and crafted in the physical world. So I like seeing what they do in the movies, and that's true of all of the MCU, how they're able to take the Infinity Gauntlet, how they're able to utilize all of the vehicles that we grew up reading about in the comics, and then seeing them actually move around. It's the movies do something that can't be done in the comics, and I absolutely adore that.
That thing has some weight to it too. When we sent the test, that was like a real
hefty.
Deal.
Well, when things are made of vibranium, what are you going to do?
That's true. So you also have, it's not out here. Do we have your comic?
So let me get it because I had to
This
have
is just one of the cooler things. We also have some great books as the comic is released. I mentioned that we always have a Funko pop out, and you quickly retrieved a Magneto.
I conjured a Magneto. Actually, a student gave it to me, but I have X-Men #1 here because it's not a great version of it, but I'm so passionate about this specifically that I don't need to own a lot of comic books. I'm not the kind of person that needs to have drawers and drawers and drawers of comics, but having the first of what I think transcended the comic book world with this really first team comic. And that's what I love so much about the X-Men, that I was like, all right, I saw this once at a Comic-Con, and then I said, I don't need to have one mortgage when I can have two. So I had to get X-Men #1 for my personal it makes me feel comfortable knowing that I have one, so that if all the others are destroyed in the world somehow, there's still one hidden somewhere.
And here you are on a podcast at work, being able to use it. So
Absolutely.
second mortgage, well worth it.
Well worth it. Thanks for the pay. Being a teacher, is making us so wealthy.
Yeah, that's usually we do go by extravagant things.
That's what teachers are known for.
Salaries.
Yeah, see, I don't have children, so I have comic books.
And that's why we, have those $1 million salaries, so we can buy these luxurious
the big
things.
bucks,
Yes. So let's talk about this. I'm not going to say I'm woefully ignorant about the X-Men, but I would have a basic knowledge of the characters, a little bit of the background. So I asked you before we got started here, if I needed to know 3 things about the X-Men, what would it be?
I think the first one I just touched upon, the fact that they're the team, I think is the key thing to try to sell. If you're trying to sell an audience on the X-Men, it starts with them being a group of students. And back in 1963, when it first came out, it was a more attainable and accessible way for superhero-dom to reach into a child. And so I think the first thing is a team book makes it a completely different experience, a lot more characters, but then they learn so much from each other. So instead of just reading an Iron Man or a Spider-Man where it's a lone person against all of these obstacles, this is a group that has to fight obstacles together. So that team aspect is probably the first. The second aspect of it, I think that's really important, is the otherness. Each of the characters, even the main characters, are not just because of their mutancy. In some cases, it's a physical disability. In some cases, it is they're culturally separated. There are a lot of different things that in 1963 were ahead of its time. So that otherness in each of the characters makes them so three-dimensional. The good guys and the bad guys. I am sitting here dressed as a villain for a reason. He is a villain, absolutely. But I've never read a more justifiable villain. And they've transformed his storyline. Magneto has a long history since the 60s as to why his otherness makes him a villain, but there's something about him that is also right.
I totally get that. Like watching the movies or just watching the cartoons, like he does have something there. Like there are people who are after them. There are people who want to do harm to them. Yeah. So take the bull by the horns.
And he, there's this. It's a leadership dynamic that really is my third reason. I think a comic book that does deal with, in allegory, civil rights issues. Yes. And moves ahead a lot of thinkers who are children not being manipulated, because I think that's a wrong thing to say that comic books do, but I think it broadens perspectives, especially in a time period before social media, before having an open world, reading the storylines in the X-Men about how they're all different and they all have this otherness, but this school setting and this cohesive vision allows them to fight for a cause that they all agree with. Yeah. And the Charles Xavier kind of figurehead and his dynamic with Magneto, these two kind of teachers of different philosophies, peaceful resistance, or when do you have to fight, when do you have to pull a trigger, when do you have to become a little bit more violent, is very appealing. X-Men #1 starts with Magneto trying to really start a war with the United States government, and so it's from the very first issue, I was drawn into the conflict because you understand both sides of it. And even though we don't live in a world with mutants, we do live in a world with others. With others,
yeah. And it's interesting to think. I don't think I've realized 1963.
It's very ahead of its time.
I mean, and just like right in the teeth of the civil rights movement.
And they utilized it. A lot of people were upset, I think, because eventually Malcolm X and then X-Men, there was kind of this link where people might have thought there was, in the comic book realm, some sort of side being taken, which it isn't, because Charles Xavier usually wins in the 60s, especially when these comics came out. Magneto was always foiled because militancy was not, and I'm sure Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, all the writers, were making sure that the peaceful coexistence was the stronger storyline there, but they still tackled many issues that were happening in the newspapers. So for a comic book to also not be escapism, and for there to be in the pages of X-Men hope, but also the conflict writ large, utilizing the allegory of superpowers, I think was, to me, I think it's one of the most impressive works of art that, we've created. So, the Marvel Cinematic Universe does art in a different way. I don't agree that all the X-Men movies necessarily do this well. Yeah. But I think that, when you have a single book hero versus a team book, it's going to have a larger impact on your audience. And the cartoon series, I think, did that really well too. Might usually was not the only solution in the cartoon. There were peaceful solutions to problems. And watching a cartoon in the 90s that was very complicated.
Absolutely. Going back and watching it, it was something, being, 12 years old or
Absolutely.
whatever when it came out, that things
There's
might not
so
get.
many episodes where it's like, was this written for kids? Because I'm sure when it was airing in the mornings in some places, the way in which they solved problems was a little more complex than a lot of other cartoons were doing.
Yeah, and that's available on Disney Plus. That was cool to kind of see that they
Absolutely.
have that whole series.
And
there.
I think there could be more. I think that animation could have a resurgence. Everything old is new again, So I think there's something about finding a way to make more of those great cartoons, because I feel that the last season of the XMen animated series could have been even stronger. It kind of tapers off a little bit.
Okay.
So I like Disney kind of is a revisionist in that way. They can go back and say, want another season?
Yeah.
The voice actors are still around for the most part. We can add to
throw 'em
this.
in.
And they have the X-Men now, so I'd love to see what they're going to do with this franchise.
It is interesting to think, like, even, Batman the Animated Series was another that was, like, just really good, like, and not like traditional cartoons, the way we think of children's cartoons.
I would be sitting here dressed as the Joker if we were doing a DC podcast, because I think I was molded a lot by the animation and specifically the comic books that I grew up with.
Yeah.
And definitely as a DC child, the villains there in the Batman universe, similar to Magneto, not that they're always justifiable, the Batman villains are not, but they're extremists. And often that's what Batman himself is. He's an extremist who's trying to be a vigilante. So I love that Batman always had the double-sided coin.
Yeah.
Two-Face joke. That's a Two-Face reference for you. But, X-Men did that as well by having these strong voices, of an Xavier and a Magneto saying, how do we solve problems, with words or with wars?
Yeah.
And I just thought that was ahead of its time. In the 60s, the Cold War was even happening. There was a lot happening.
Yeah.
So for those comic books to be addressing it, even if in its smallest fashion, was impressive.
So talk about Magneto.
Yeah.
So I think to connect two things. One, from doing this podcast, from watching these movies, I feel like the MCU has gotten stale.
Okay.
It's just like these movies. Is that okay?
It's fine. It's fine. I blame Hollywood because there is good writing in the comics, but the comics don't always translate to film.
The films, I will say,
Yeah.
the films of it have just kind of like we just talked about Guardians, which I enjoyed.
Yes.
But then we also had a discussion. I was here with Elliot Heath.
Yeah.
How good is it? Which we agreed it was good, but then compared to like kind of this string of lackluster movies, when you get one that's like not bad, you're like, oh, this one's really good.
There is also a saturation point.
Yes.
So they had to now go into animal torture to get our attention, and that's an extreme thing to have to do.
I'm gonna take a swerve here because you're a perfect person to ask. I've asked this to Mr. Sweeney,
Okay.
their staff aficionado.
He's excellent.
That is too much? When is it too much? And his stance was like, there is no too much because 20, 30 years ago there was none of it. So enjoy everything you get, and that it's all out there. The
Sweeney's
little,
a Star Wars fan, isn't he?
Yes,
He's
yes,
willing
he
to
must
accept
be, yes.
every single thing that comes
Throw it out there.
I understand that. I'm a little bit more of a conservative regarding that. I would rather wait 10 years for a great movie than get one a year, and they're all a little stale.
Yeah.
I have that about me, but I'm also patience is the key as an audience member. You have to wait for it to get to a point. I kind of like that they waited to bring the X-Men into the MCU, because they could have just kind of Captain Marveled a scenario and thrown someone in and then given them a side movie. Like there were ways which worked. Not that that's a bad thing, but there are too many characters in the X-Men to do that with.
Yeah.
So you can't justify an X-Men crossover unless you're going to make it a little bit more of a galactic event. So the multiverse is the perfect way to do that. It's a long game too. I mean, Disney could do this forever. There's enough writing, there's enough material, there are enough side characters and small books. You could do an entire series based on, the X-Men that didn't make it. So, there's a whole list of X-Men characters they tried in the 70s that just disappeared. So there's a large well to draw from, but Hollywood does sometimes go for a formula.
Yeah.
And I think that's the issue I've actually had with the MCU from the beginning, and why I've never come to the 27th. I
just tried over and over again. You refused until we agreed
it never
on the
happened.
X-Men.
It never happened. But we'll make that up and pretend like it did. I don't like the humor of the MCU.
And I think
I have an issue with the humor.
And I think that's part of this Phase 5, this current of their wacky. Like that's the word I always go with, their wacky elbow in the ribs.
And I love the directors of so many of the films, and their wackiness is present in the movies, but I feel that they become a little bit the same after a while.
Yes.
Because like, oh, this worked, this got a good reaction, more of that, please. Instead of taking some risks, doing some different styles, and so the comedic aspect of the MCU is always a little bit disappointing for me.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that they're bad. It's just I think it's hard to get comedy right. Dying is easy, comedy is hard.
Yeah.
But I've always felt that the movies don't quite capture some of the humor as well as they could.
Yeah.
And that's, and that's going to be a risk for the X-Men as well. I feel that I love the books and I love the characters. I'm very passionate about them, but Hollywood's going to do what Hollywood's going to do.
Yeah.
So I'm ready for some disappointment. I don't know if that's a good thing to kind of as a selling point, but knowing that there are going to be a bunch of X-Men movies coming down the pike, yes, I assume.
So that's what I'm trying to. So the question I was going to ask is there a connection? How do we get them in?
Now that you've opened a multiverse door,
they can just all go in. So we've seen like Wolverine, hints of Wolverine in an upcoming Deadpool.
Right. And so once you've made any links to the fact that there is another version of Earth out there that has this,
anything can happen.
You know, Beast, an X-Men character, could create a portal and ask Forge, another mutant, to open doors to the multiverse. They can do absolutely anything because the X-Men can kind of do anything. There's an X-Men for everything. Handy-dandy X-Men. Everyone's got a power for something.
Like the Swiss Army knife.
They are. You really could have. They could have a mutant that's able to, and we've already seen this. America. I'm not sure if she's a mutant in the Multiverse of Madness, who can, with the star, open up portal. Things like that kind of already exist. So all we need is a doorway into. Was it 515? What's the number that the X-Men are in? I don't remember what number they're in. But I don't think it's hard to do. They just have to do it right. Yeah. Or it's a concern. The fact that we already had a Black Panther without a Storm link, you know, there are things that are obviously the universe is going to now be its own thing. Because it's too late to go back and retroactively change storylines they've already done that had strong links to the X-Men. Endgame. You know, the X-Men should be involved in some of these major events that have already happened in the MCU, but they didn't have access to the characters yet.
But now they do.
Now they do, so then anything could happen. But they can't retroactively go back and say, oh, yeah, they were there.
Yeah, they were there. You didn't see them?
Unless that's what they do. Because they could absolutely fabricate a world where it's like, the X-Men were there.
Yeah, you just missed them.
Absolutely. And Scarlet Witch then operated them because there's a plot line where Scarlet Witch says no more mutants and they all vanish from the comics for a while. That was a cool storyline. And it could happen again. So you can almost do anything to make it work.
So then is a possible connection, and this is also a question, is Magneto Wanda's father?
Yes. I can't say no to that because I am a staunch chronologist. And in the texts, that's the parent. And the Quicksilver and Wanda, the Maximoff storyline is linked to Magda, which was Magneto's wife when he was trying to be in hiding and not use his mutant powers and try to lay low. Yeah. The whole Scarlet Witch being his daughter, it has to be. I haven't missed that it's not there. Yeah. It hasn't bothered me that they haven't talked about it because their relationship in the comics is that estranged. She doesn't really get along with her father, more her brother, which they did show in the films.
And they cite that, like, so in Age of Ultron, they're kind of like, the belief is that, they were in the lab and they were given these powers. But when you get to WandaVision, she has them at an earlier age.
And I believe that I think it's like we said before, there's something nice about the X-Men having a power that comes to life inside them genetically because she had maybe flashes of it as a child because there are some Lencher Magneto DNA in there, and then later in life it came out. And maybe she doesn't look into her lineage in this version. Yeah. The Elizabeth Olsen doesn't care who her parents are. That version of Scarlet Witch is not as emphatic as Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch in the original comics, who want a relationship with their father and then hate their father. And then, the good thing about comic books is that they're a soap opera.
Yes.
They are such a long story that when Scarlet Witch has issues with Magneto, and if they ever finally show that on screen, some old school fans will love that father-daughter tension, and a scene will really, depending on the actors they've got, a Magneto and a Scarlet Witch going at it would be great, but we haven't missed it.
Yes.
That dynamic is not necessary in Scarlet Witch's story because they focus so much on her as a mother and her children. That's a great throwback because of her relationship with her parents, but we haven't explored that aspect. We absolutely could.
I think getting the X-Men into this, I think this will be...
There's a lot of depth you can pull from it, but you then have to, again, patience. Your audience has to wait for that.
Yeah.
And do they want to? They might want more animal torture. I don't know.
It's true. Brought my kids to see that. The animal torture.
Yeah, that's rough. Gotta be rough, right? Do they ask questions afterwards? Do they just cry a lot? I cried a lot.
So my younger guy did that. I knew, like, watching first going, I was like, oh, geez, this is going to be Rocket's backstory. Yeah. This is not going to be good.
It's
so I made sure I sat next to him. I was in between the two of them. The older guy is fine. Yeah. The younger guy, I kind of just kept, reaching over, make sure he was okay. And he was good. Yeah. Until he went to bed, and then Waterworks with Mom about poor Rocket, and he didn't get to stay with his friends.
Should the MCU be traumatizing our children? Disney always has, so yes. I was traumatized by Disney, and I'm fine.
I know. I mean, that was like the big Bambi.
Yep, it traumatized me.
Dumbo.
Absolutely.
I mean, Dumbo when he's reaching through the bars like that. Is memory burn?
Similar to Scarlet Witch and Magneto, they always go for the parent angle. They know what they're doing there.
It's always the parents. All the traumatized back to the parents.
And there always is, and that brings us to... Into the Woods. Did you see Into the Woods, Mr. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's another thing
That's
entirely. We'll do a
whole
podcast on musical theater at another
podcast.
time. But Parents and Children is actually a great thing here. Charles Xavier is a surrogate parent to all of the X-Men.
Yeah.
A lot of them, because of their mutant abilities, are kind of outcasts, that otherness we talked about before. So the found family idea that's present in the X-Men, I also feel is kind of ahead of its time. That's a very big thing now, is realizing that your family is not always the people you're genetically linked to, but the people that you protect others with, or that you form bonds with. And in 1963, I think that was way ahead of its time.
Yeah.
So a lot of those elements of the deep connections you can make with people because of what you have in common, or your conflicts that you can share that allow you to get past some of the difficulty of your formative years.
Yeah.
The X-Men kind of told that story really well.
Yeah. 2 different questions for you.
Okay.
One, do you have a favorite character? Favorite. It could be anyone within the whole thing. Could be a hero, a villain.
I
mean, you're dressed as Magneto.
I am dressed as
don't know if
Magneto,
that's
and I love him as a villain, but my favorite X-Men character is Nightcrawler.
Okay.
And I love Nightcrawler, and I feel that of all the X-Men movies, X2 is the only one that really does a lot of stories justice, including his spirituality, which I find, Nightcrawler looks like a demon, but is a religious, he has a spirituality about him. And I always thought that the German circus performer who then had to figure out how to save people, and the teleportation aspect of what he's capable of, he also can go into another realm of reality. He's got a whole magical kind of connection too, which I've always found there's more to that story than we've really ever seen. Even in the Nightcrawler stories, we've got questions. Yeah. And because of the spider web of comic books, he's got all these links to Mystique. You remember that from the 2000 movie? Yep. There's all these kind of other connections that I find are fascinating, and you could kind of go into a long analysis of all of the different ways in which these characters connect to each other.
And you have one X-Men to represent you in some type of battle.
I mean, send in Charles Xavier. I mean, you want to change someone's mind? Send in a telepath.
Just do that.
I mean, and that's the thing. Is he overpowered? Questions would happen. But if I had to send somebody and I got Chuck in a wheelchair sitting there, I'd be like, come on, roll on in.
Just push him.
Help me out, Charles.
Take the brakes off and shove him in there.
I think he would be a good choice. I mean, I know that a lot of people want to put a Wolverine in to defend them physically. But unless we have a mutant threat against me, most of my enemies are pretty human right now, and my telepath can turn off their brain.
That is a good
Turn them into oatmeal in their head. So
real thinking man's answer, Mr. Schwab.
If you're going to go for the bigs, I know Wolverine's very popular.
Yeah.
But he wasn't around till later. So when you first read this, Charles Xavier was like your go-to. Cyclops was still learning how to be a leader, So I was drawn more to the bigger conflict, which is the Magneto, Charles Xavier ethical situation of how do you change the world for the better? We're trying to help Homo superior become part of the world. Do we do that with words, or do we do that with force? Yeah. So I love that there's that dichotomy. So all the other characters are pawns in the game, and Magneto kind of sees them all that way too. Yeah. They're kind of the ones playing chess, which is the best thing I think in the X-Men movies that we see is their friendship, because it's not just two people, it's two ideologies, and they're still friends. Which I think is the most important thing, is they could just obliterate each other, and they don't, and they respect each other. And that is why marriage brought me to the X-Men. It's true.
They both know that they each play a role in trying to figure the existence of mutants out.
And their friendship is at the core. In the comics, that friendship has been turned around a lot. But in the actual movies, and I love specifically, I think it made Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen friends. Playing the roles created a real life friendship, and I think the two of them kind of brought something to those parts that if it had been lesser actors, I think they would have had lesser movies. I think they would have the whole thing probably wouldn't have worked as well.
And that is with those movies, is like those two up top. Absolutely. They carry it.
That's who I went to see. I was going to see them in those movies. At the time, remember, I was new to it, so I was like, who am I seeing in this? Oh, of course I'm going to love the portrayal, even though I think Ian McKellen was seen as being too thin. He was not as the muscular Magneto in the comics, but it's the power of acting. Yes. I'd have to say that as a theater teacher. Yeah. You don't have to have a look to be a character. You have to have a mindset. Yeah. And Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen as those two head-to-head. All the other pawns are great. You got a Hugh Jackman. You got a Famke Janssen. You've got all these characters who are wonderful. Halle Berry is Storm. And I enjoyed all those performances. I think they cast it well for that time period. I have a magazine article that goes back to Wizard Magazine. Do you remember Wizard Magazine? Don't. Okay. Wizard Magazine was all about comic books in the 80s and 90s. And there's if we could cast the X-Men, and Patrick Stewart is actually in it, because at that time he was Charlie. He was on Star Trek, and they're like, "Oh, okay, bald guy, done." Yeah, and he's perfect for it. He really is. And a bunch of the other casting choices that we didn't see, like a Tina Turner as Storm back when she was doing her Thunderdome acting days. So it's really fun to kind of see who the big actors you would put into some of these kind of iconic roles.
Yeah.
They're so iconic to me anyway.
It was such a snapshot of the year 2000,
Yes.
especially the female leads.
Yes.
Like, so Halle Berry, Rebecca Romaine,
Oh,
Famke
yes.
Jensen, Anna Paquin, they're all like,
Absolutely. Yep.
they're really representative of that time. It is this snapshot. Is that Hugh Jackman's, like, is that his big break? I mean, I know he was definitely around, obviously, but like
I
is
saw
that
him in
what put
Oklahoma,
him
so I
out?
knew him on stage before I knew him on screen. So
mean,
I was lucky that way.
One of the more fascinating actors,
Oh,
entertainers, where you're like, that's Wolverine? Like, so many people knew him as Wolverine, and then you're like,
It's amazing
seeing him,
what else
you
he
know,
can do.
the
is
Music Man.
incredible.
or,
Yes, exactly. And
yeah.
he's a song and dance man, but he also, because of his physique, he's a little too tall for Wolverine. We're not going to be able to, you know, the comic version of him is much more compact,
Yeah.
muscle, you know, and like 5 foot. That's it.
Yeah.
So they had to kind of change some things for that, but I think he was able to bring such a snarl, such a charisma,
Yeah.
and he brings a power to the role that he's not giving it up. I mean, he's been playing it now for 25 years
Yeah.
too, right? So he's going to be in the new Deadpool, right?
Yep.
I think he is. And there are others. I've heard that there's going to be other cameos from that 2000 movie coming back in. So
Yeah.
that'd be kind of fun. When does Deadpool come out anyway?
I don't even know. I mean, I just saw and they only released like the art for it. You know, just kind of
Their
the
patience. That is the
patience.
overall
It's
arc
the
of this.
long
The
game,
long
the
game.
long game.
Gotta wait.
I like to think you're the Hugh Jackman of Townsend Harris, Mr. Schwab.
Oh,
you know?
well, that might be
You know,
Mr.
the
Heath Ledger,
acting,
but,
the you know, the charisma, the love of you know.
thank you.
all
I'm a very
things
passionate
X-Men.
person, as you can see.
Yes,
that
yes,
could be to
yes.
my detriment. At
I mean,
times.
when you walked into this room with the Magneto costume,
on.
really wonderful.
Got to do it.
What did you think of that? I don't think I've seen any of the other ones.
Okay.
I rewatched. I saw it when it came out
Yeah.
in 2000, and then I rewatched it this weekend between soccer games and Cub Scout meetings.
Yeah, you got a life.
You know, there's a lot going on here. But well, yeah, what'd you think of this? The first one. Let's go with the first one.
I think the first one set the stage, and we were excited to see the X-Men realized in, you know, with special effects and with, you know, we really wanted it. It was an audience kind of pleaser that way. Not everyone loved everything about it, but I think for the movie of its time, it stands up well enough. And they were pushing some boundaries because superhero movies were not as popular in the year 2000. So
Yeah.
they were trying things. Everyone in the black leather. They were trying to like make it more. And, you know, I think Disney has done a great job of now trying to really bring the color of the comic books back to life.
Yeah.
Because in the 90s, to try to make it more agreeable to an audience, they were just making it leather and black and dark, thinking that that was what superheroes were believable.
And there's
to
even
look
like a line when they're in one of the planes and they're like, "What do you want us to wear? Yellow spandex?" or
Of
something
course.
like
And I sat in the audience and probably said out loud, yes,
Yes,
I expected yellow
that's
spandex.
perfect.
I don't know why you're not wearing that.
Yeah.
But aside from that, I also thought the performances were good.
Yeah.
The pacing of the movie was good. And what works really well with one is number two. I think they work well with each other. You set up the characters, and then there is a longer time to kind of enjoy them up until the Phoenix sacrifice at the end of the second film.
Yeah.
I think they work really well together. And then I cannot recommend a single film after that.
That's it.
That's it.
Is there? What
I
were we
didn't
saying?
like 3. I didn't like any of the First Class movies. I didn't like really any of the other movies that they tried with the X-Men characters. And I'm sure all the acting is good. I blame a lot of the writing for it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it falls into that formula thing I mentioned earlier, which to someone who's read a lot of comics, you want to be surprised. X-Men 2 has a great kind of plot twist surprise in it that is, it's what comics do. On the last page of a comic book, right before you're about to find out what happens, they'll leave you hanging, so you have to buy another one, of course. But there's something about that in a movie I have an expectation for, too. It's like, when does that issue end? When am I turning the page to realize there's no more story and I have to wait till next week, next month to find out what's happening? And not only X-Men movies do that, but a lot of the X-Men comics do. So to me, that's a missed opportunity where it's like there are a lot more moments of what's going to happen next. That anxiety buildup that happens when you're reading a comic that doesn't necessarily happen when watching a movie.
Yeah. What do you think about? I feel like growing up, I think I might have liked Gambit.
Oh, Gambit's awesome.
Well, talk to me about Gambit.
Awesome character. Gambit's great because he's representative of a thieves guild, and he's already got so many skills when we meet him. We don't have to see him as a student like all the other characters learning their trade and learning how to use their abilities. He's already got skills like the bow staff and, you know, his kinetic card throwing tricks and all that.
Yeah.
That's kind of the basics of his character. He can do a lot more than that. So
Yeah.
the fact that he has these pulses of power that he can utilize, and he is this stealthy and this very well-trained fighter and this rogue makes him all the more appealing. In the cartoon show, they gave him the most ridiculous Creole accent.
It's so heavy.
It is so ridiculous. But we needed that, I think, also in the time period as a child. I didn't really know the world as well, again, before the internet. So it's like, all right, that's an accent from where? Where is that supposed to be? It actually made me more interested in the world because X-Men, unlike a lot of the other stories, if you're reading, Iron Man and he's just kind of flying above New York or saving the world, he's not as international, I feel, as all the X-Men characters. So you learn about accents. And I in the comics as well, they would write the Scottish brogue into like Moira McTaggart or, Banshee. And so like reading an accent, I kind of was not educated by the X-Men, but I think there was something about open the door to other countries, mutants in other places, gave me a realization that there are other people, other children, other people on the whole planet that another comic book might not have opened my eyes to.
Does it ever spread around the world? Like, do we see X-Men from around the world?
Yes, eventually, and more so in the comics. I feel the movies kind of touched upon that a little bit with the Apocalypse to kind of show that Storm in Africa and the first mutant Apocalypse himself is kind of from the basin of the universe, the Mesopotamian area, like they kind of show across the planet. And by the time you bring in all of the X-Men, it is a team kind of like Star Trek, which is my true love. It's everybody on the bridge of that starship is from somewhere else on Earth. So it becomes a global effort.
Yes.
A global effort for peace. Yeah. And the X-Men does that as well. It took until 1975, I guess, when they started to bring in Colossus from Russia, which was a big deal because we were kind of, not that we were enemies with Russia, but we were enemies with Russia. So
especially in entertainment.
Right, and, so to then bring someone to work alongside the X-Men, who is from the other side, across the Iron Curtain, whatever it is another thing, a leap forward in comics that was trying to promote this peaceful coexistence. And that's, I think, the larger messages of the X-Men. If you read the issues from the 60s, 70s into the 80s, they were affected by the politics of the eras, which I don't know that every comic book has that, but I think that's interesting to read the comics through the time period and realize what was happening in the world.
Would it be safe to have you and Sweeney have a Star Trek, Star Wars discussion? Would
be very safe because I am not only a diplomat, I'm a trained Dominion agent, but that's a Star Trek thing that people might not know. So, I could definitely talk to Sweeney about Star Wars, and I do like Star Wars. I think this is the truth about me. X-Men is actually why I'm a teacher. Star Trek is why I am married, which we talked about a little bit as well. And I think Star Wars is really the Force and all that, spirituality. I like all of those elements, and they do all coexist. So there's no war to me. I don't have to fight against my fandoms.
Fair.
Fandoms tend to coexist, and they do represent parts of me. I always felt that way about what I've learned in my life from the entertainment I've consumed.
Yeah.
The entertainment.
The connection between X-Men and your teaching.
Charles Xavier.
Just being able to.
You know what? We work in Xavier's Institute for Higher Learning in many ways.
Yeah.
And we work with so many mutants. And I think being a teacher in all my schools, not just Townsend Harris, but you do kind of have to find the way to unlock those mutant potentials. And so just knowing that my grandmother always wanted me to be a teacher, and I read a comic book character that kind of inspired that a little bit, it makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's, it seems cheesy or trite, but it's also a motivation. Sometimes you need that motivation to say, if Charles Xavier can do it, I can.
And I can do it.
Exactly. And there's something about that character also being vulnerable.
Yeah.
I think teachers have that side of them too, where it's like, yes, we have the power of the world. We are telepaths and we can reach out, but at the same time, Charles Xavier can't even walk across a room.
Yeah.
The vulnerability of that character, who's got so much power and then none at all in some ways, no freedom, confined to a wheelchair. There's some beauty in that too.
And I think in the classroom, that vulnerability is where the relationships can be built with students. It's not the wall that's put up between. But
so though dressed as Magneto, I think I have a soul of a Charles Xavier.
Okay, so you're my teacher today. We'll wrap up with this. Yeah. XMen Homework. What is my homework? I'll watch X2.
Yeah, watch X2 and see that is a companion piece to the first one. And I do recommend the 90s cartoon series because it's excellent.
I'm going to finish that. When we first, because this was like months ago, we talked about booking this. So I was like, let me go and watch that. And I watched the first season.
Yeah.
But I didn't finish it, and I really enjoyed it. I think there was some nostalgia to be like, remember it being on. But then it was also good. Also, like, it was digestible. It was like
the theme song, man.
So that theme song will be opening this episode. So when you hear it, we will, and it just sticks in your head. And I loved in the movie,
they put it there for a moment.
Yes,
yes. When Xavier rolls it in the gold chair. Xavier in that gold chair is amazing. I'm glad they finally showed that with Patrick Stewart, because you grew up with seeing Xavier in that more alien wheelchair and not the human one. So that's great. And anything that you can consume in terms of the issues of the comic books, there are so many great ones. And because this is the 27 and it's linked to the MCU, there are many times since 1981 that the Avengers and the X-Men met up in the comics.
Okay.
So there are a bunch of different things. There's a series called Bloodlines. There are a couple of different ones where they fight each other as well. And back in, I think, the early 2000s, you could vote on who would beat who. Magneto destroyed Iron Man. Just pretty much crunched his suit.
Seriously.
He really just, that was one of the fights. There were a bunch of them in there. The X-Men did not win all of them, but they won their fair share because the X-Men, I think, and then why I like them so much, is that they can probably wipe the floor with the Avengers.
That is another good discussion. I'm sure that'd be one we could knock
I think
out there.
Storm could just take down Thor right away, and everyone's going to fight me on that. But Storm is a goddess. I almost cursed right now, but I stopped myself.
Thank you. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
that.
Thank you.
Well, I think we did it.
I think we did.
Excellent. Really
Excellent. I see what you did there.
Didn't even mean to do it, but I'll take credit for it.
Excellent.
Yeah. So we are the 27. You can catch us on Instagram at the 27THHS, YouTube, Classic TV on YouTube there. Check out our latest episodes. You can watch Mr. Magneto don his helmet there. Check out some of our other episodes that have been posted. We got Guardians going up soon. We have a few others up there. We are still moving our way through the rest of this school year. We got Quantumania coming up, which I still haven't watched it. Because everyone says it's so bad. Everyone says so. Amber,
you don't have to watch it.
But
it's so mean.
Talk about it, I feel like
Are you a Paul Rudd fan?
I do like Paul Rudd.
He doesn't save it. But I think you have to watch it because it's now, unfortunately, your job.
I have to watch it because we need to talk about it. But I've definitely been just kicking the can down the road.
Yeah,
I know. I don't want to watch this.
I know.
But that's that kind of staleness, disappointing thing that I'm feeling after
get ready
running through 30 of these movies essentially last year. Oh, these were good. Some were better than others. But then
it's rough. And they can't all be gems, and I know that. But then stop for 5 years. Come on. Give us a break. Take a break.
Take a break. But there's that content machine that needs to be churned. Disney
Plus.
Plus.
That's a mistake, It is a mistake. But there's nothing we can do about it. We have no power here.
No.
None.
No. Superpowers or otherwise. Teachers. That's our superpower.
We are teachers. That is true.
That's it.
And that's the limit. And so do your homework.
That's it. I want to thank the producer, whose name is Irene, doing our all behind-the-scenes work. Skandalakis.
There it is. There's the extra.
Thank you to Rajvi, our film editor, and thank you to you, Mr. Schwab.
Thank you to you
for coming in. We appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
We will see everyone next week on the 27th. Take care.